Chapter 5. The mornings are Technoblade's favorite part of being out on the open sea. The light of the sunrise across the waters is like a painting, 100 different colors decorating the horizon, coloring the rippling waters like stained glass. He picks up his old routine with ease, starting each morning with that same beautiful sunrise, standing alone at the bow of the ship to watch it first crest over the sea. It's quiet and peaceful, and everything he so desperately needs before starting his day as captain. It grounds him. Erit has begun to join him. She's as much of a constant as the sun itself, elegantly poised and dressed just as pristinely, even as she blinks sleep from her eyes. She often drifts to his side to join him at the railing. She doesn't often speak, but rather partakes in the silence alongside him. She cannot see the sunrise, but she seems to appreciate it nevertheless, as the early morning light warms her cheeks. The silence is comfortable, and despite their lack of conversation, he finds himself eagerly looking forward to her company each dawn. "Technoblade," she says one morning, and reaches to take his hand. He surprises himself by meeting her halfway, allowing delicate fingers to curl around his wrist. "Could you describe it to me?" His mouth opens and closes, faltering around the right words to say. He's not sure he could ever capture the beauty of it. He's not sure any words he could think of would be enough to paint a picture of it for her. And she laughs, thumbing gently across his skin. "That's all right," she hums. "I've seen it before. But how does it make you feel?" He's struck by that question. He considers it for a long time, staying silent. To him, the sunrise is one of the most beautiful things he'll ever see in his lifetime. The first time he saw it rise out at sea still sticks with him, as does the awe and emotion he'd felt that day. It stirs up an odd, warm feeling of nostalgia in his belly when he thinks of it, a pleasant tingle that works its way all the way down to his toes. The sun has always been that beauty, that constant, even in his hardest days, and so to him, it's a companion, a friend. It's a promise of a new day, of a fresh start each morning, and it makes his heart sing with a delight he can't quite put to words. He opens his mouth to try and answer, but Erit is already smiling. "It is beautiful," she agrees, and with that, she lets go of his wrist and leaves him alone once more. Mid-afternoon, a few days later, finds Technoblade out on the main deck, peering up the long ladder to the crow's nest. A familiar face grins cheekily down at him, all sharp teeth and bright eyes, as Phil beckons him up to join him. "How do you even get up there?" he asks bluntly, gesturing vaguely towards his shoulder. Phil's injury was scarcely a week old. There was no way he would have been scaling the rigging just yet. Erit definitely wouldn't approve, but he also knew Phil considered himself far above any orders of medical reprieve. "I climbed," Phil chirps impishly back. "Come join me." Technoblade rolls his eyes, giving a long, skeptical look at the ladder. He weighs the possibility of his venture carefully in his mind, his prosthetic suddenly feeling very heavy and very stiff as he eyes the long climb up. Phil seems to notice his hesitation, because his smile softens into something far less daring and something a bit more supportive. "You could do it, mate," Phil offers, one hand over the other. Technoblade frowns. A part of him wants to forego trying altogether, to brush Phil off with a laugh, even if it means he has to endure the relentless heckling from above for the remainder of the afternoon. But another part of him really wants to try, to give it his best shot, to push himself, to see if he can do it. Once upon a time, this task wouldn't have even required thought, but now it instills just the faintest flicker of fear in him as he imagines a misplaced hand and a long fall. A stubborn defiance burns in him, intent on snuffing out that fear once and for all. And so he nods once, steps up to the rungs and begins the climb. It's long, laborious, and almost painful. More than once, his grip nearly slips, threatening to send him plunging back down. He hooks his prosthetic around the rungs and uses his other hand to cling and propel himself upward, his lungs heaving for breath, the slight chill of fear numbing his limbs and fueling him to reach the top. And reach it he does, throwing himself gratefully over the ledge and savoring the sweet feeling of solid ground beneath him. "Knew you could do it, mate." When he looks up, wheezing from his place on the floor, Phil is staring at him with his lips curled into a warm smile, his gaze half-lidded and soft with unfiltered affection. The second pirate catches his gaze, and he looks away, his smile broadening back into that usual impish grin, but not quickly enough to hide it. Technoblade hesitantly smiles back, finding himself suddenly wishing the pirate would look at him like that more often, rather than his usual obnoxious mask of bravado and sarcasm. To be looked at like a friend rather than an enemy. He wants that. He's not sure when that change happened. Perhaps it was when Phil first saved him, and just took some time to set in. Perhaps it was when Phil offered him a spot beside him at the crew's evening meal. Perhaps it was when the man took it upon himself to ensure Technoblade was properly eating and drinking, despite his duties. Perhaps it was during the many times he caught Phil looking upon the youngest of the crew with undisguised warmth, his prickly exterior receding. Perhaps it developed over time. Perhaps it isn't even real, a result of being trapped on a ship with very few people to confide in. All he knows is that in his time as the captain of the Argo, something pivotal has occurred. He no longer looks at Phil with that old twist of disgust or anger or loathing, but rather finds himself feeling something different entirely. A fondness of sorts. He finds himself laughing at the bad jokes, listening eagerly along to his whimsical stories, and gravitating toward the man as they make their obligatory rounds about the ship. Phil, for his part, doesn't seem to have changed much, treating him as casually as always. But the man's callous remarks don't sting anymore. Instead, it's easier to see the warmth behind the flippant insults. The way Phil's smile softens in the morning when Technoblade first greets him, and the way his teasing tends to encourage him to push himself past his self-perceived limits. So yeah, maybe Phil isn't so bad after all. "Isn't it great up here?" Phil asks, suddenly. The man has balanced himself on the rim of the nest, his legs kicked up over the sides, and swinging freely. It can't be comfortable, but the man's posture and expression scream peace, his eyes fluttering shut, and even the slightest worry lines wiped clean from his brow. He's seen Phil like this before, each time very much the same. Phil is at his most relaxed up here, in the sky, with the wind in his hair and the sun on his face. He looks younger, more at ease, his careful walls that Technoblade's only just begun to recognize, lowered when he's all on his own. "You look like a bird," he responds dryly, when Phil once more extends his arms like he did that very first day on the ship. Phil laughs and waggles his fingers playfully, giving an experimental little flap of his arms. Perched even higher above, atop the flagpole, Brian gives a rasping caw of agreement, rustling his wings against the steady ocean breeze. "I wish," Phil says. "I'm jealous of you, you little shit." The last part is directed up at his feathered companion. Technoblade wishes he understood that longing in Phil's eyes, or the way he leans into every caress of the wind, despite the way he sits so precariously balanced. Seeing the ground below him is dizzying, a sharp spike of adrenaline shooting through his veins when a particularly strong gust nearly knocks him back, almost taking his hat right along with it. He's pretty sure he's not meant to be in the sky. "I think I'd prefer to stay on the ground," he mutters softly, moving back to cling to the mast for support, keeping his gaze trained firmly on his first mate and decidedly not on the deck far below. Phil watches him with poorly disguised amusement. It's not so bad, once you get used to it. He lowers one hand to settle it on the rim of the nest, but keeps the other slightly lifted, toying with the breeze as it dances across his fingers. When I was a kid, I used to think that if I spent enough time up here, maybe the gods would take pity on me and I'd grow wings. Technoblade muffles a snort into his sleeve, and Phil gives him a wry smile. You laugh, but I fully believed it would happen. Broke my arm jumping from the rigging and everything. Nearly gave my parents a heart attack. Technoblade imagines a young Phil, teetering precariously on the ship's railings, his arms akimbo as he walked the narrow edge, pretending to fly as the ship bobs in the waves. He finds himself smiling, and it isn't teasing this time. I've always wanted to fly, Phil breathes. The wind in my hair, the weight of gravity off my back. Nothing holding me down. Sailing is the closest I can get to that feeling. Maybe in the next life you'll get your wings. Technoblade jokes lightly. But Phil's eyes glimmer with a childish excitement at that, and he doesn't dare shut it down for a moment. You think so, mate? Maybe, Technoblade answers honestly. He's never really thought about what lies beyond life. He's always been more for living in the present, for working with what he's got, and not worrying about what could have been, or what might be. Still, it's not unpleasant to imagine Phil in a different life. He pictures him with the wings of the crow he loves so much, laughing as he bobs playfully through the clouds, boasting a bright smile, free of hardship. He wonders what Phil would be like in another life, were he not shackled by the constraints of this one. Would he be happier? Would he have resorted to the life he does now? Would they still have grown up as enemies? Is Phil even still his enemy? That'd be pretty cool. Phil replies softly, unaware of his conflict. The man kicks his feet a little more, his boots thunking noisily against the wood. What would you want to be, mate? I don't know. Technoblade answers honestly. No matter what, Phil says, and his voice goes soft. I think I'd want to be free. And Technoblade can agree with that. It's the reason all sailors take to the sea, in one form or another. The endless sprawl of ocean as far as the eye can see, the lawless beauty of the open sea, free from the restraints of society, where even the lowliest of men could find themselves again. He wanted to find himself too, once upon a time. He thinks he might have forgotten his original intentions somewhere along the road. Maybe this is what it took to finally remind him again. Phil, I think... Captain! A soft call interrupts them from below deck. Nikki is peering up at the crow's nest, one hand shielding her eyes from the sun's bright rays. Are you up there? Sounds like you're needed, Captain, Phil teases. Go on, I'll follow you down in a moment. And the moment ends. He excuses himself with a mutter and starts the laborious task of scaling back down the ladder, which, unfortunately, is decidedly harder than climbing up it. By the time he makes it down, he's a mess of heaving breath and rosy red cheeks. But to her merit, his helmsman does not comment on his state of disrepair. By the time he's finished answering her question, charting a course for the nearest port for a brief supply run, he's managed to regain some of his composure. He squints back up at the crow's nest as she takes her leave, and sees no evidence that Phil's made any attempt to actually join him. He sighs. Phil? A blonde head pops over the rim. Phil blinks sheepishly down at him, boasting a rather strained grin, his injured shoulder clutched in a white-knuckled grip. You can't get back down, can you? Technoblade deadpans. Nope. They're in Technoblade's quarters. A kit of medical supplies spilled across his bed, Phil sitting cross-legged atop the blankets while Technoblade gathers both a damp cloth and his nerves. He turns to Phil with a baleful glare and raises the towel at the rather guilty-looking pirate. Right, come here, you stubborn bastard. Phil squawks as Technoblade none too gently prods and pokes at the injury, taking a peek at the torn stitches and watching as fresh blood bubbles up at the surface. He takes the towel and dabs carefully at the wound, grimacing a little as his patient gives a dramatic groan and tries to pull away. "Hold still, you're making it worse." "It hurts," Phil whines plaintively. "Yeah, well maybe pretending to be a bird with a bullet wound to your arm wasn't the best choice then." Technoblade gripes, unsympathetically, tugging the offending arm close again as Phil hisses. "Gonna have to redo those stitches. You really did a number on them." Phil huffs, and otherwise does not respond, though he holds carefully still as Technoblade begins the painstaking process, only muffling muted noises of protest into the sleeve of his shirt as he works. Technoblade can feel his venomous gaze lingering on his back, despite the silence, and he pointedly ties the final knot a little tighter than necessary, grinning as the pirate yelps. Phil glares daggers and yanks his shirt back up over his shoulder. "Anyone ever tell you you're an awful patient?" Technoblade grunts, as he sets his supplies aside to admire his handiwork. "Once or twice," Phil answers with a rueful grin as he rolls his shoulders. As Phil stretches, joints popping as his fingers curl towards the ceiling, his shirt slips over his other shoulder, revealing pale, freckled skin and something else entirely. Technoblade's blood runs cold. "Phil," he says lowly, and his tone is enough to make the man freeze in his place, still half-stretched. "What's that?" Blue eyes go wide, round with surprise and shock, and a mixture of humiliation and sorrow that makes Technoblade's gut twist painfully. The man averts his gaze, following Technoblade's own to the patch of skin beneath his collarbone, puckered and ghostly white and scarred, a perfect pea seared into his skin. He's quick to pull his shirt back over the injury, but not before Technoblade has had the chance to get a nice, long look at it, long enough to make him feel sick. "I was just a boy," Phil breathes, so softly Technoblade nearly misses it, and in his voice is the most raw emotion he's ever witnessed from the pirate. Quiet and aching, and desperately vulnerable. And though Technoblade dreads the answer, knows he will hate it no matter how Phil chooses to respond, he can't just leave it at that. He has to know. He needs to understand. "How old?" 12, I think," Phil rasps. "I was 12 when it happened, at least. 11 when they caught us. Celebrated my birthday in chains, awaiting my own execution." Oh gods. He knows the severity of the punishment for piracy. He knows that even the youngest of them face those consequences, but even still, the vision of a young Phil, too young, far too young, to ever face such horrors, bound in chains and sitting alone in a cold, dark cell awaiting his execution. He swallows back his nausea, and looked to the Phil of the present. The man is eerily still, his face ghostly pale and his jaw clenched tight, his shoulders trembling beneath the weight of his memories. He has the sudden urge to reach for him, to stretch out a hand of support to ground him. And so he does, his fingers resting lightly on Phil's knee as they sit side by side. And Phil doesn't try to move away. Instead, he takes a deep, shuddering breath and continues, his voice eerily faint, almost detached. "My parents were pirates. I was born into it, the family trade of sorts. I was born on the sea, out on the open waters, never knew any different. Didn't really know what we were, what people thought of us before it happened. All I knew was that I liked sailing, and sometimes things would get dangerous, and I'd have to hide below deck till it was over. We ran afoul of a Navy ship one day and lost. Before I knew it, my whole family was in chains, and me along with them." And Phil goes on to weave a tale so sorrowful, so bitter and laced with horror that Technoblade can scarcely bring himself to listen. He tells the story of long nights in the dark brig of a Navy ship, sandwiched tightly between his parents and his crew. He recounts a long, tumultuous journey to the shore, where they were shoved in a prison cell too small for their company. He recalls the terror of a child, forced to wait alongside his parents with the knowledge of his impending death. He speaks of cold chains and cruel hands pinning him down as a white-hot iron drew nearer and nearer until... Phil's jaws abruptly shut with an audible click. His hand drifts to his collarbone. My parents found a crack in the corner of the cell. They and the others worked day and night to widen it. In the end... And he lets loose a long, trembling breath. In the end, I was the only one small enough to fit through it. I was the only one who escaped. Technoblade's breath catches. I stuck around port as long as I could. Phil's voice tinges with bitter, hollow detachment. His eyes look dull, almost gray. I waited for them. They told me to go, and I didn't. His fingers dig into the fabric of his pants, white-knuckled, his hair falling forward to curtain his eyes. I waited too long. I stayed just long enough to watch their executioner pull the lever. Technoblade feels numb, his jaw opening and closing as he struggles to think of what to say, what to do. His heart aches for the man, who he now looks at through a different light. It's easy, now, to see the tightness in his smile as he speaks, and the crease in his brow when he laughs. There's a gurgle to his breathing, a sheen to his eyes, as Phil pushes back whatever sorrow he should be feeling with a strangled laugh. It's a ghost of what true delight should be. A mask, a facade. It looks wrong. The silence has gone on too long. Phil barks out another watery laugh. Sorry, mate, he murmurs through a hiccup as he scrubs at his eyes, Technoblade watching helplessly on. Not really sure why I'm dumping all this on you. And Technoblade can see him start to shut down again, getting ready to close up his walls once more, and he speaks up before he even has a chance to think. No, it's... He flounders for the right words to say. There's an openness between them now, a raw vulnerability he never expected. He doesn't want to mess this up. Thank you. Phil's head jerks up, his chuckle quieting. For what? He sounds breathless, disbelieving. For telling me. For trusting me. You didn't have to do that. And he means it. For the man, a man he'd once considered an enemy, his prisoner, to be so open with him. It means something. There's a flicker of warmth somewhere in his heart, amidst the regret and rage he feels for the suffering his first mate endured at the hands of the ones he'd once sworn allegiance to. He'd heard similar stories a dozen times before, had witnessed many a hanging in his days as captain. Never before, though, had it ever struck such a chord in him. He'd never liked death, but the notion of pirates as the enemy, as a plague to be swiftly stopped, had been repeated in his training like a mantra. Pirates were criminals, the cause of endless death and destruction so long as they roamed the seas, and were meant to be treated as such. Or so he'd thought. He still disagrees with Phil's morals, would still rather imprison than kill, would rather trade than steal, but does any man truly deserve death? He tries to imagine his days back as a naval captain. Would he have imprisoned Phil along with his family as nothing more than a criminal? Would he have sent a child to their death? Would he have hesitated at all? How many men had he sent to the same fate before the night of the storm? How many more had his life not been changed that day? And then it hits him. He would have sent Phil to his death. Oh gods. He breathes aloud, his voice hoarse. He sees Phil shooting him one last, long, searching look that goes ignored as he's escorted from the hole by a half-dozen guards. Phil, bound in cruel iron shackles at his hands and wrists. kept in a cold stone room until the guards come and roughly drag him to an old wooden platform. Phil, lifting his chin high and grinning even as the noose is slipped around his neck, biting into fragile skin. Phil, dangling limp and cold, his lips tinged blue, that smile forever forgotten by the world. His heart, hammers in his chest, his stomach roiling, his blood roaring in his ears as he struggles to fight back the horrible images. No? Techno, are you with me, mate? Phil is staring at him, with wide, round eyes glimmering with undisguised concern, a hand outstretched and his fingers curling comfortably around Technoblade's prosthetic. He doesn't flinch at the cold of iron and wood instead of skin, his gaze fixed solely on Technoblade. All at once, everything is clear. I'm sorry. For what? Phil is starting to sound like a broken record, although this time his voice is so very small, full of careful, hesitant confusion and quiet, desperate hope. I would have escorted you to your death. Phil's lips part in a broken little O. His eyes flash with something. Grief, hurt, anger, he can't tell. There's a long moment where he looks away, a moment where the silence hangs too heavy and Technoblade is left to stew in the weight of his guilt. And then he raises his free hand, the other still curled carefully around Technoblade's prosthetic, and touches his face. Technoblade flinches at the contact at first, but the pirate's hand remains, scrubbing gently away beneath his eyes, swiping away tears he didn't know were flowing. Oh, mate, Phil murmurs, and he leans into the pirate's touch against his better judgment. It's been so long since someone touched him, since he received more than a passing clap on the shoulder. Phil makes a soft sound at this, and he smiles, a smile that is both warm and gentle as the morning sun, and yet somehow sad. I don't hold that against you. It was what you knew. Technoblade shakes his head weakly, and Phil's hand cups his cheek, stilling the movement. Nobody is innocent, Phil says firmly. Me least of all. There are a lot of things I regret, and a lot of faces that keep me up at night. Perhaps I do deserve to be hung, like they say. Technoblade opens his mouth to protest, but Phil raises a hand to silence him. What I'm saying, Techno, is that I don't think there's a right side. I used to, but I'm not so sure anymore. You were doing what you thought was right, and so was I. You would have died, Phil. Hey now, Phil says dryly, his lips twitching up in the faintest hint of a smirk. Don't count me out that easily, mate. Technoblade laughs. It sounds frail, even to himself, but it's genuine. Yeah, fair enough. You did somehow survive a sinking ship from a jail cell. And then he blinks. How did you escape? Leverage, mate. Phil winks. Technoblade grins, and that warm flicker returns. Despite everything, he says, as Phil's hand drops from his cheek to curl lightly around his own, this time the one made of flesh and bone. It's a firm yet surprisingly gentle grip, and he squeezes right back, shocked by how familiar the gesture already feels. Despite everything, you saved me. Phil nods, his smile dropping to something smaller and more reserved. Why? Despite my reputation, Phil says. I don't like to watch good men die. You're a good man, Techno. I knew that from the moment I met you. You just needed some encouragement. You pulled me from the water. I did. You paddled us to shore. I did. You... He pauses, swallowing back emotion. You paid the doctor. You paid for my treatment. Phil nods, looking a little abashed by the acknowledgement of his good deeds, his cheeks flushing pink. Thank you, Technoblade says again, locking gazes with the man. Anytime, mate. Phil replies quietly. And then something clicks. Wait a minute. Where'd you get the money for that? You were a prisoner. We searched you for... Phil gives a nervous grin. You stole from my ship. Well, I couldn't let all that gold go to waste, could I? Oh, you bastard, Technoblade says, and the word is said with far less venom and much more affection. He can't stay mad for long, not while looking at that smug, shit-eating grin, and the two of them dissolve into merry laughter together, leaning on one another for support. The grim atmosphere quickly evaporates. The night is filled with their quiet chuckles as the two of them spend the rest of their night together, eating, drinking, and sharing together in the retelling of their very first meeting, taking turns weaving the tale into something far grander than anything that actually occurred. It's a tale to tell to the crew one day, should they get the chance. It's the happiest Technoblades felt in a long time. Who would have thought? Phil laughs suddenly, running a hand through his hair as he tips his head back. What? A pirate and a former naval captain. Friends. Technoblade smiles warmly. Yeah, friends.